views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Straight ahead on this edition of Perspectives, some say the verdicts in the Kyle Rittenhouse and Ahmaud Arbery trial embody a bigger problem with our justice system. Plus, we'll discuss that with our law enforcement expert and talk about how prevalent is racial bias in the criminal justice system and should we reassess self-defense laws. That's coming up on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, just speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. And as always, you can watch Perspectives every week here on BronxNet's Channel 67. Now, we invite you to stay connected to us on our social media platforms at BronxNet TV. If you're trying to reach me personally, you can reach me at social media on Facebook at Daren C. Jaime. That's my professional page. And then also on Instagram and Twitter at DCJaime23. There you can find some information as well as some inspiration as well. Well, we start off talking about this. There are many opinions in the verdicts of the recent Kyle Rittenhouse and Ahmaud Arbery trials. And some legal experts argue that the jury verdict was correct on the law, but at a time of racial tension, high-profile cases are not without racial scrutiny. Today on this edition of Perspectives, we talk about one of the common factors of both cases, self-defense. Joining me now to give his perspective is retired NYPD Detective Marq Claxton. Mark is a committed voice for the civil and human rights and criminal justice reform, and is also director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance, and no stranger to us here on Perspectives. And Mark, good to have you back, brother.
Great to be back with you, Jay.
Hey, listen, talk to me about this here as we talk about this. As we look now at the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, we'll talk about that first. A lot of people up in arms with this verdict. You have a young man, 17 years of age, crosses across state lines with an assault rifle, and then goes on to kill two people, but yet and still found innocent. And the question in the hearts and the minds of many is, what went wrong?
Well, I don't think there are many people who are absolutely shocked by the verdict itself. It's consistent with a long, troubled, painful history of trying to get justice as it relates to support of Black people and Black issues. And although many people will point out that the individuals who were killed and injured by Mr. Rittenhouse aren't of color, aren't Black, they were most definitely supporting and providing voice for Black issues, consistent with the history of civil rights work. As a matter of fact, people have to keep in mind that in the 60s, there was civil rights, there were movements and bus rides down to the South, and a lot of white folk were engaged in that civil rights struggle. And had they been assaulted or injured or killed, these incidents were still regarded as race-related, and that was the case here. And because of the dynamic of race involved in this particular case, the decision by the jury is consistent with history, and that is that there is so much leeway and so much deference paid to white assailants, especially those who are striking out against Black people or Black interests.
Yeah, but when you look at it and you look at what exactly went down, the way the judge carried out and the way his demeanor was, some of the things and statements that he made, it almost looked like it was a recipe for disaster from the beginning.
Yeah, without a doubt. It was clear, I think, to anyone watching. You didn't have to be some skilled attorney to pick apart and just pick up that there was something askew with the proceedings in the courtroom. Some of the commentary made by the judge's decisions about what would be admissible and applicable in the court were disturbing and conflicted, convoluted, and confusing. It was only confusing, realistically, for those who don't understand the dynamic the role that race plays in the criminal justice system. Something that I'm sure we'll be speaking a little bit more about.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, the role of race in the criminal justice system. We know that it's been unequal for a long period of time. And as you mentioned, this particular murder consisted of two people who weren't of color, but yet and still they were out there supporting Black Lives Matter. And as I shared with some people before, let this be a voice for Black people, that we aren't necessarily always pro-Black in as much as it's about being pro-justice, because the two victims in this particular trial were white.
Right. And I think for people, they have to really remember and maybe read up on the freedom riders of the 60s. Many white people who traveled down into the southern states to stand up, to protest, to object to a lot of the racist laws and conditions in those states. Those freedom riders deserved a certain amount of protection. And what they were doing was standing up and defending the interests of Black folk and placing their very lives in jeopardy because of that. Our criminal justice system continues to be two-sided, and that is, you have one set of laws, rules, regulations for white people, and another set for people of color and the poor. And that's something that's unavoidable. And I think the Rittenhouse case, the Rittenhouse trial, the judge's conversation and commentary during the course of the trial, and even the strategy that the defense used is clearly indicative of a larger problem. And we just have to face the reality that until we decide to change it, there is a racial component baked into the very system of what we call justice.
Let me flip for a moment and go into the Ahmaud Arbery, the trial concerning the death of Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery certainly not on trial, murdered by three individuals, and yet still a guilty verdict comes. And while people rejoiced, there was still some sentiment of anger, frustration, and even betrayal when we saw a defense attorney refer to, dirty nails as a part of dirtying up the victim in the case. And so, while the evidence was clear cut, certainly the defense did a good job in dirtying up the victim. And we know that's expected of defense attorneys, but yet and still, we know that also it crossed racial lines.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the commentary by the defense in that particular case was the defense using color-coded language in hopes, a desperate attempt to reach out or to appeal to any member of that jury who was somewhat open to playing the race card and denying Mr. Arbery's family justice, if you want to consider the verdict any form of justice, at the very least accountability. So once again, the proceedings were clear, and I think the defense attorneys' commentary, both defense attorneys, both the male and the man and the woman, they both made comments that clearly indicated they were appealing to they were looking desperately for one juror who would jump on that race train and provide some relief to their clients. Thankfully, that didn't occur. But I think it's kind of cold comfort that in 2021 we really have to shout and scream and applaud so heavily when a lynching. When a victim of a lynching receives some sort of accountability or justice. It really is telling about where we really are at this point and what our expectations, and I mean the greater community in general, specifically the Black and brown community, what our expectations are when we appeal to the justice system for just that justice.
We talk about the word justice, and I heard that so many times said in the case of these three individuals found guilty, that justice is actually served. I said it several times on my show and on other platforms where I was invited as a guest, that justice really, from my perspective, has not yet been served, because you have a guilty verdict, but yet and still you have the sentencing phase, and that's where sometimes things get a little bit dicey. Do you think that the way things are going right there, with the guilty verdict and the way that this trial flowed, that we will see severe sentencing in the case of these three individuals?
I've learned over the years there's no way of predicting these type of things, and just when you think you have some level of accountability or justice, the system sometimes will pull the rug out from under you. The empire strikes back, so to speak. So I don't have any real expectations of a full and complete and appropriate sentencing for these individuals. So I'm hoping to be pleasantly surprised, but it would not shock me if the sentencing turned out to be less than adequate. And I'm much more comfortable nowadays, and I had to be pulled to this position, that not all verdicts that we believe provide some relief to families is justice. I really believe we're talking more about a certain level of accountability and an opportunity to find, some additional facts out for the family who may need that in order to have some semblance of closure moving forward.
I want to take a quick break and come back talking with Marq Claxton. After the break, we're going to discuss self-defense laws and should there be some restrictions on what we're seeing. We're hearing a lot more people use self-defense when it comes to these type cases, but should there be some restrictions? Talk about that when we return right here on Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime. And welcome back to Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are talking with Marq Claxton as we're talking about the verdicts in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, as well as those three men found guilty in the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery, what many people call a lynching. As we still wait the sentencing phase for these three individuals, questions still remain. As we talk about self-defense, many people are up in arms over the self-defense ploy that's being used by defense lawyers, questioning the fact of how much can we continue with the self-defense laws the way that they are. Mark, as I bring you in, I want to ask you a little bit more about this here, because should we see some more restrictions when it comes to these self-defense laws? I mean, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery's three assailants, it looked like an open and shut case. But for a moment, a lot of people held their bated breath, because they know how these self-defense laws play out.
I think it's very important for people to realize that these self-defense laws originally did not apply at all to Black and brown people. So keep that in mind when we're talking about kind of reconfiguring the laws, or changing the laws themselves, or whether or not they're applicable or appropriate in this day and age. That they didn't apply to us. There was no way in the world that a Black person who was about to be lynched and defended him or herself was going to be authorized to utilize self-defense when trying to fight for their lives. So let's keep that in mind. Another thing that's really confusing or different about self-defense nowadays is the inclusion of firearms and other weapons itself. And then you add on to that other dimensions such as stand your ground laws, and you really have it's a lot of confusion. And it's a trick and a trap door for a lot of people. And disturbing is that you have this disparity in how self-defense is respected and applied based on race. You have white folk who tend to use self-defense in a particular way, and they can use that in court just the same way they use stand your ground, which is just an extension of self-defense. And then you have a similar fact pattern with a Black person, and that self-defense will not stand up in that court. So it's a lesser component of a larger issue and problem in the criminal justice system that needs to be really fully examined.
And the question is that many people say is, listen, would Kyle Rittenhouse be in jail if he was a black man doing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many cases of this misapplication of self-defense, and I think what's interesting about the Rittenhouse case is that the defense attorney used the same strategy that police officers often use when you have a defendant police officer on trial. In essence, they're using a self-defense claim against the victim more times than not. The Rittenhouse defense thought that if Rittenhouse used those same kind of terminology, self-defense, and even utilized some of the same tools in applying self-defense, a firearm, a weapon, a gun, that perhaps they would be graced with a dismissal or an acquittal on the charges. But what he found out, and other people will have found out also, is that those rights that are given to police officers using self-defense are vastly different than civilians. There's no way to make any blanket statements about how effective self-defense is because there's so many dynamics involved in it, and primarily the racial dynamic. But there are also issues of the economy, of poverty, and the role that plays in sentencing or determinations in court.
Talking about court, when you look at the Rittenhouse case, people are saying, well, what about the feds? Because it seems as though when people of color are, murdered and there's an acquittal, the hope has simply been a federal trial, federal charges being brought against an individual. So while one may escape criminal court, there's always possibly the hope that federal charges might be brought out there. What do we think will happen with the Rittenhouse case? Do we see federal charges possibly coming?
I think in general, federal charges in these type of cases are past prime. The federal government has not been effective over the past 30 years, if you will, in prosecuting or charging in these particular cases. There's always a possibility, and yes, it is something that should be pushed and demanded and really tried for. But it's unlikely that there will be some additional federal charges that could outweigh what will happen in the state level courses. It's going to be key what happens in sentencing, I think, to determine whether or not the feds are even going to bother the charge in this particular case. There's more than enough evidence to do so, but I think history has shown us that the feds are very selective about which cases they want to proceed with, and then also how committed they are to prosecuting these cases. So I'm way over the thinking of the federal government and the intervention as being significant or substantive and changing the needle one way or another.
What's the path here to create change? Obviously, we have to attack some of these laws and really deal with it at the grassroots level. But what do we see as a path for change, given the fact that you have this Rittenhouse verdict, and sometimes it's dependent on the state that you're in and the laws of the state. But is there anything that can be done on a sweeping front that might be able to overturn some of this?
I think everybody should be pushing for some level of consistency. There should be consistency in laws, like, for example, gun laws. There should be a level of consistency in how you prosecute certain laws. And there should be a consistency in how the feds approach whether or not they're going to take over an investigation for a case, what the charges are, et cetera. It's all over the place. It's too subjective to be useful or reliable. There has to be some consistency, a consistent model of cases that will automatically go to the federal government for investigation cases, and they have to come in early. You can't come into a case way after the state investigation, prosecution, trial, then come in, because there is some bastardization, if you will, of an investigative process when the feds now come in to reinvestigate a case that's already had all of these steps concluded. So there just needs to be consistency on a national level about what cases qualify for federal investigations.
Marq Claxton is our guest, talking about he's talking about these cases. We'll come up after the break. talk about the Black Law Force Alliance. We'll talk about that when we return right here on Perspectives. We're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. We are joined by Marq Claxton, former NYPD detective and also director of the Black Law Force Alliance. And Marq, I know we talked a little bit about these trials, but let's talk about the work that you're doing right now. And you're the director of the Black Law Force Law Enforcement Alliance. Share with us a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Well, the organization continues to really be more of a networking institution than anything else. In addition to a lot of the public awareness that we engage in, we do a lot of public education. We do what used to be called What to Do When Stopped by the Police, which now is called Surviving Police Interactions. We also work alongside many different jurisdictions to work on some of their reform ideas that they have floating around. And we have formal and informal relationships with different jurisdictions working on their law enforcement criminal justice packages and the changes that are coming around, especially on the tail end of the discussion about defunding the police, et cetera. And finally, what we've also done and begun to expand into, and our brother Jerome Rice has been spearheading this, is really engaging in a conversation about the corrections departments across the nation and trying to get some consistency in how we address this incarceration rate and how we can prevent people really from being incarcerated. So anything community-based, we're willing to engage and be part of. And then, of course, I offer commentary on a regular basis to some of the news channels and different outlets.
I want to bring it home to New York City for a minute. We're getting ready to get a new mayor. New York City Mayor Eric Adams getting ready to take office. Former NYPD sergeant himself, and really one that's been decorated in the police department, then going to another career of public service. Many people concerned about quality of life issues in New York City, and then also the relationship between New York City police and the community. Are you optimistic that, given the fact that incoming Mayor Adams will be successful in definitely bridging that gap between police and community? Because we know that from the start, current New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, outgoing mayor, I should say, has had a frayed relationship with the NYPD.
I am optimistic, but I'm obviously biased. My brother Eric Adams and I are very close. We were both founding members of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. He's a retired captain with the NYPD, and he has really laid out a brilliant vision of how to address public safety, and that is to have New York City do something that they've been doing around the country, and that is shifting from what is a traditional policing model to more of a public service model, bringing in some other disciplines, some other professions into the role of creating a safe public space. So I think that will be revolutionary moving forward. Of course, we're fully supportive of Eric Adams and his staff, and we'll be actively engaged and offering recommendations, suggestions, like we've always done throughout the years. But I think it's going to be significant. I think what will occur in New York City is going to be the establishing of the blueprint that will be used for agencies large and small across the nation. That's what I suspect, just based on what I know is coming down the pipe from Mayor-elect Eric Adams.
Can you give us a little bit of an inside look as to what it's like to be a person of color in that New York City Police Department? Because we know that it is gotten better in terms of racial equity, in terms of officers being hired, but yet and still, when we see top brass, we know that that top brass is still, there's still a disparity there.
Well, I tell you, there have been significant strides over the past 10, 15 years in the NYPD as far as representation and diversity at the top levels. We now have there are significant numbers of black chiefs and people, button pushers, people who are in charge of things and in positions of power and authority in the department itself. The numbers for blacks in the NYPD pretty much stays consistent for many decades. But there are blacks who are much better positioned in the NYPD to affect change. The challenge in any agency, any department, not just the NYPD, is it is not enough to have a diverse looking staff. You have to have a diversity of thought and opinion and ideas. That serves, I think, everyone pretty well. And you have to really be focused and committed to applying justice, not only outside on the streets, but inside your particular agency. That's really the key. So I always push back a little when people say if we had more blacks in this particular department, it would be better. Not necessarily, because too often the police culture subsumes everything else. And you'll find that there are blacks that will engage in the same atrocities and bad deeds as others are. So I think it's important to have a diversity, a range of cultures, ideas, philosophies, principles. Make sure it's wide ranging in your agencies.
Got to go real quickly. Got less than a minute here, but I want to talk about that blue wall of silence, given the fact that we are in this heightened state and police officers are held to a higher, well, not higher level, but held more accountable. Are we seeing more of the blue wall of silence really come down? We saw that happen in the case of George Floyd. Will we continue to see that going forward?
No, police culture is too entrenched in a lot of these agencies and entities, and it will stay that way until you have a dramatic shift in personnel. Like I said, the police culture is capable of subsuming all other cultures, and too often people come into the police department and become subsumed by the police culture and beholding to the culture of policing as opposed to the culture of people.
Well, Mark, we got to leave it there, but thank you, my brother, for joining us here for another edition of Perspectives, bringing us some real serious insight into these trials and then also behind the badge. So thanks a lot for joining us, my brother, and hope we'll catch you in the new year.
Please. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All righty. Marq Claxton, our guest here on Perspectives. Want to let you know, stay tuned to Perspectives. We'll continue to follow all the breaking news, bring you the people that will have a voice, and then definitely give you an informed opinion so that way you can find out a different perspective. And that's what we do here on Perspectives. We encourage you to stay connected to us because guess what? When it comes to a perspective you don't know, just share it because it might make a difference in somebody else's life. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care. Thank you for watching this edition of Perspectives. We'll be back next week, God willing, with another show.
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he